Good morning. Today we move on to John chapter 13, which is John, namely washing the disciples' feet, which we start out reading in just a moment. But this is a beginning of a long section of the Gospel of John that's private. Jesus and his disciples, Jesus and the 12. That's everything here is not part of public teaching and ministry. And the other Gospels tend to concentrate on the public ministry of Jesus, his teachings, his miracles, the events that people witnessed. And John, of course, is writing a different Gospel. He's not trying to duplicate Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And that's why we find so much unique material in John, because first of all, he was deliberately not duplicating what was already known from other Gospels. And we've seen before that he assumes that you have some knowledge from the other Gospels. But he's giving us difficult things to understand, things that they didn't understand at the time, and things that were not generally known because they were private. And so this is a section that's fairly private from John 13 for about 5 chapters here. So let's begin with the first 5 verses. Before the Passover festival, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Now, by the time of supper, the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his robe, took a towel, and tied it around himself. Next, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and to dry them with the towel tied around them. There's this little connecting word in verse 4, so, that follows that Jesus knew that he was going back to God. The washing of the feet was done by Jesus because he realized this is the end. The end is coming. And this is something I want to teach the disciples before I go. So this is actually related to his death, but it's a teaching moment. And I like to look sometimes at how early Christian commentators preached and commented on the passages. And a couple of them noted something that had kind of always been in the back of my mind that I hadn't focused on, that when does someone get their feet washed in this culture? When they enter the home. When you've been out walking in the street, they had sandals, and the streets are dusty, and they get dust all over their feet. So when you entered someone's home, they would have a servant come and wash your feet when you were entering. But when you're entering, it's not really the best time to teach a dozen people a lesson, one at a time. So instead, Jesus waits. They have supper, they have fellowship together, they're all relaxed around together. Now that he has his audience all at once, he begins to wash their feet. He takes off his cloak, wraps a towel around his waist. He's deliberately changing his appearance to be like a servant. Take off the nice clothes, put the servant's towel on, and start washing and drying people's feet. So he's set up a teaching moment. It's the climax of the supper. Wouldn't really work doing it one at a time as they entered. And then, of course, we get Peter's reaction to having his feet washed. He came to Simon Peter, who asked him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I'm doing, you don't understand now, but afterwards you will know." That's one of the themes we keep seeing in the Gospel of John. John is reflecting back on the things that they didn't understand at the time they were happening, which makes them more like advanced teaching for Christians as opposed to Matthew, Mark, and Luke preaching the gospel for the first time to people who haven't heard the gospel. Afterwards you will know. "You will never wash my feet ever," Peter said. Jesus replied, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Peter tends to bounce back and forth emotionally, doesn't he? He's an impetuous type of personality. "One who has bathed," Jesus told him, "doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you." For he knew who would betray him. This is why he said, "You are not all clean." So, once again, going back to early Christians commenting, Peter didn't understand why his feet were being washed because, remember, most Jews up to this point in time had what kind of an expectation of the Messiah? Out of all the things we studied a couple of years ago in Messianic prophecy, that the Messiah would be a new prophet, a new king who's victorious, a new high priest. He would also be a suffering servant who dies for the whole people. Now, out of those four thrusts of Messianic prophecy, there was one that they were focused on in the first century, the victorious king. That's what we want. We want the victorious king to come and defeat the Romans. Suffering servant, that was a little confusing. How can the victorious king be the suffering servant who dies? How can this even be the same person? And so they focused on what they desired, and that was the victorious king. And so right up to this moment, Jesus has been slipping in little prophecies to the disciples that he's nearing the end. So what are they expecting? If we're nearing the end, then the battle must be coming. That doesn't really put Peter in the frame of mind for a servant Messiah. It just doesn't fit. The victorious king is what he's looking for. But Jesus is trying to teach a lesson of humility, and that just doesn't fit the messianic expectations of the Jews. And that's why during these 5 chapters or 6 chapters that we're going into here, John keeps commenting that they didn't understand at the time. But then after Jesus died, at which point they still didn't understand, but then after he's resurrected and speaks to them, then they finally understand. Then they finally look back on a lot of these things and say, oh, that's what was going on. That's what Jesus was trying to teach us. but not until later. This time, instead of John narrating, we didn't understand until later. This is the one time, I believe, where Jesus actually spoke to them and said, "What I'm doing you don't understand now, but afterwards you will know." Jesus himself is speaking to their timeline of when they're going to understand. And then he gets to this ambiguous kind of play on words that Jesus pulls in verses 10 to 11. Where Peter has said, "Don't just wash my feet, wash the rest of me too, wash my head," And Jesus says, "You are clean, but not all of you." And it works the same way in Greek. All can have two different meanings. Not all of your body, or not all of you in this room. And so there's a double meaning there. He's talking about Judas. You're clean, but not all of you, not Judas. And so there's a physical cleaning here, but there's also a spiritual cleaning. Jesus is doing something to prepare for his death. And just as we saw Mary, Sister Lazarus, last chapter, wash Jesus, anoint him with oil, and so on, which was a foreshadowing of his being buried, because when you're buried in those days, you get anointed with oil and spices. Jesus is foreshadowing purification in a spiritual sense, to purify this flock who's following him. And then we get to explicit teaching about the meaning of what just happened from Jesus. When Jesus had washed their feet and put on his robe, he reclined again and said to them, "Do you know what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and this is well said, for I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example, that you also should do just as I have done for you. I assure you, a slave is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. I'm not speaking about all of you. I know those I have chosen, but the scripture must be fulfilled. The one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me." Going back to a messianic prophecy. I'm telling you now, before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am he. I assure you, the one who receives whomever I send receives me, and the one who receives me receives him who sent me. Now, verse 16, I think, is the heart of this passage. I assure you, a slave is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. What's Jesus saying? Well, if acting like a servant is not beneath his dignity, and we are lesser, we are inferior to Jesus, then acting like a servant isn't beneath us either. A slave is not greater than his master. If the master is willing to do something, the slave can already say, "Well, I'm not doing that." And someone who's merely a messenger for a king, for example, isn't greater than the king who sent him. We're Jesus' messengers. He sends us. We're not greater than him. If something isn't beneath Jesus, it's not beneath us. And that's at the core of the example that he set and the teaching that he delivered afterwards.
In other words, we can't do for him what he's done for us.
We are always We're following his example, but we are always inferior to Jesus. That's our position relative to Jesus. But therefore, we can hardly object to doing anything that he's willing to do. And then he starts prophesying, quoting David in a messianic psalm, "The one who eats my bread has raised his heel against me. One of my own is betraying me. One that I eat with is betraying me." And of course, they don't know exactly at this moment what he means. And that's kind of interesting to me. It's not like when Jesus talked about Judas, and we're going to get to this in the next section, but when Jesus starts to talk about someone here is going to betray me, what is recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is the disciples start saying, "Is it me? Who is it, Lord?" It's not like they all knew. I always suspected Judas Iscariot. I'm just waiting for him to betray us. That wasn't it. They were mystified. Now, John records a little later here that Judas, in his opinion, was filching money out of the money bag. But betraying Jesus unto death, none of them saw that coming. This was not something that they understood. It is yet another example of something Jesus said that they did not understand.
Well, Clark, was this the first time that Jesus actually said, "Do you understand what I did?" And then he explained it? Because most of the time, they didn't. John says so. We didn't understand what he was talking about.
Right, but I don't recall John as narrator says that, and I don't recall other occasions where Jesus said that.
Yeah.
Where Jesus said, "You don't understand." Obviously, many of the things Jesus spoke that were hard sayings, he knew that people weren't understanding, but he didn't come out and say,
Here's what
"You're not understanding, but you will later."
Oh, right. Okay.
But there
But
were,
this time he tells them, here's what it means. This
Right.
time he says,
Right.
there were other instances when they were walking, he would explain to them what he had told.
Or he would give a parable that most of the crowd didn't understand, and then in private he would explain to them, here's what that parable of the sower, for example, means.
Well, it's the same with parents and children. Children don't understand until they get older what the parents told them.
Yeah. Yeah. We are going to follow that example of our parents, but we're probably only going to follow it later when we've had time go by and we understand the example. And that's the way these disciples are with Jesus. Later they're going to follow Jesus as an example, but right now they don't even understand the example. But they will. And in this case they'll understand pretty soon, because this is the end of Jesus' life. His resurrection appearances to them are only days away. So the way it was phrased here, I'm telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am He, or that I am the Messiah. They will only really understand the nature of the Messiah and how Jesus was the Messiah when He dies and is resurrected. At this moment, they really still don't fully understand. But He's telling them, you're about to understand. I did this so that you will understand. Now we get to explicit discussion of Judas Iscariot. When Jesus had said this, he was troubled in his spirit and testified, I assure you, one of you will betray me. The disciples started looking at one another, uncertain which one he was speaking about. One of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining close beside Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him to find out who it was that he was talking about. So he leaned back against Jesus and asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus replied, he's the one I give the piece of bread to after I've dipped it. But of course, they were doing that for all of them. They were sharing the bread with all of them, so it's still not totally obvious. But At that time, he makes it obvious to John. When he had dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon Iscariot's son. So I don't think all 12 of them really heard this and witnessed this in the same way that John did. And Jesus was basically whispering to him. After Judas ate the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Therefore Jesus told him, what you're doing, do quickly. And now we have another one of those examples of John saying we didn't understand what that meant at the time. None of those reclining at the table knew why he told him this. Since Judas kept the money bag, some thought that Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the festival, the Passover festival, or that he should give something to the poor. After receiving the piece of bread, he went out immediately, and it was night.
Hey, Clark, when it says Satan entered him, expound on that.
Well, that's what I want to get to in the last four.
Okay.
What does it mean that the betrayal is initiated by Satan entering him? I think Judas had free will. I don't think that, Satan just overpowered him. And, if Satan operated in that way, and if we had no protection from God to Satan simply overpowering our free will, then, he could have chosen Andrew or anybody. There's something in Judas that Judas is seeking out. He's allowing himself to be used by Satan. And not the other 11.
He was predicted anyway. There was a reason why he was born.
He was chosen.
And he fulfilled that.
Scripture.
Yeah, I think when Jesus chose the 12, that he knew that it doesn't excuse Judas's actions, but he was chosen, he was going to fulfill a role in the whole scheme.
There's two things that were come, it just occurred to me that it said that Jesus was troubled. And I just, today, it just came to my mind that he also washed Judas's feet.
Judas wanted to get the money for selling the costly perfume when Christ was anointed, not because he wanted to give it to the poor, but because he takes money out of the bag.
Right.
So he's
Up to this point, Judas has exercised his free will in a certain way. It's not that Satan just came and chosen at random and overpowered him and, made him a traitor. He's already departing spiritually from the group.
Maybe, Jesus says it's the one who dips the bread, or what he says, and then he offers a piece of bread to Judas.
Right.
And then Jesus isn't tempting him, but Judas is at the point where he has to make the choice. And if Judas takes the bread, then what Jesus said is correct. It is the one who took the bread. And at that point, he has made his choice. He's going to betray Jesus. And so Satan then says, okay, here's what we're going to do. So I think the free will part was at the point of, do I take the bread or not? Because if I take the bread, then I'm admitting that I'm the one who's going to betray Jesus.
Well, I listened to that scripture and read the scripture as he was only speaking to John. I didn't know that Judas would have heard him say to John, whoever takes this next piece of bread.
If he said it loud enough where all 12 of them hear, then
But I don't think he did.
I don't think so, because then all the others would have no mystery about it
Exactly.
at all.
I think at this point,
They would all
John,
know Judas went out, he's about to betray you.
Correct.
That's not what I
it
gathered.
sounds like John so far is the only one who knows this.
Right.
But I don't think they understood what Jesus was telling them about being betrayed. But Judas did, because he was already put out with Jesus, because it was clear Jesus knew what was going on.
But it does record that Jesus said, go do what needs to be done. if they all understood that he had just got finished saying, Judas, whoever takes this bread is about to betray me, and they saw Judas take it, why do they not understand? Why do they think maybe Judas is going out to buy stuff for Passover? That's not betrayal, so to me that doesn't quite fit. I think that Peter tells John, ask him who it's going to be, and John leans back on his breast, and I kind of get that as a private conversation, not recorded in the other Gospels, because it's Jesus and John are the only ones hearing this.
Isn't that how Satan works with all of us today as well? That, the things that tempt me to stumble are not going to be the things that tempt you to stumble or someone else. We each have our unique weaknesses, and I think Satan is always on the prowl looking to probe at those weaknesses. It's that constant battle where that's why we're told to be on our guard. That we always have the choice, but there are some days when I might be more prone to give in to that temptation than other days when I'm feeling stronger. And yeah, I think Satan probably looked at all the disciples to see who can he best use for his purposes to thwart God's purpose, and he just happened to find in Judas the weak spot that caused him to give into that betrayal, all the things that Judas was tempted by.
And remember, Satan's not omniscient, but he can observe Judas stealing money, for example. And Satan no doubt thought, this is a great victory. If I can get him arrested and executed, I've brought Jesus' ministry to an end before he can get any more followers, do any more miracles, and so on. So just at that time, just as disciples didn't understand it all, Satan didn't understand it all. If you get Jesus arrested and executed, then Satan has triumphed, right? That's probably what he's thinking. He's brought Jesus' ministry to an end before he can get any more followers.
Imagine his shock on the third day.
Judas also went to the authorities, they didn't go to him.
Right. Judas. Is there a unifying theme for the 13th chapter? And this is another interesting thing from Christian commentaries. There's a purification theme, but the purification works in two different ways. There's the ritual purification with water that the Jews are accustomed to going through, and Jesus does something greater than that. Having identified himself as Messiah, he's washing their feet. He's doing something greater than the purification rituals to purify his own group. And then a different kind of purification happens when Judas Iscariot is sent away. It's like removing the cancer, in a sense. Now the group is pure with Judas gone. So that can also be tied into a theme here that John is remembering these stories that later, in retrospect, relate to Jesus was purifying us before his death. He purified us by his teaching and his washing of our feet, but he also purified us by finally removing Judas Iscariot from our midst. So this leaves the disciples now purified right before Jesus dies, ready for his next message.
This whole episode during this time, there was so much going on, especially with Jesus, knowing that this was the last days, having the Palm Sunday, the king comes in, the humans go down, and everything else happening, the gospel,
And it takes, one week takes a third of the book here, to relate. Because John is relating everything